Price caps to stop inflation, the price of gold going parabolic, the creation of a new reserve currency, and a ban on meat production in the name of net zero. These are just a few of the outrageous predictions Saxo Bank has made for 2023, and the most outrageous part is that many of them have a chance of coming true. That's why today I'm going to summarise Saxo Bank's 10 outrageous predictions for 2023, give you my take on whether they'll come true or not, and look at what it could all mean for you. Okay, let's get straight to it. Saxo Bank's first prediction for 2023 is that a group of billionaires will get together to create a, quote, trillion-dollar Manhattan Project for energy. For those unfamiliar, the Manhattan Project was a US government program which resulted in the creation of the atomic bomb. Now, the authors of this prediction argue that the demand for electricity is going to skyrocket in the coming decades. This is because governments are pushing for all transport services to switch to using electric vehicles, and everyday life is becoming ever more digitized, which logically requires ever more energy. The authors accurately point out that energy growth is being hindered by restrictions on investments in fossil fuels and the inherent unreliability of existing green energy sources such as wind and solar. The authors believe that billionaires will eventually come together to solve this self-inflicted energy crisis. They even go as far as to say that the trillion-dollar energy project will be called, quote, Third Stone. Now, Third Stone will effectively aim to crowdfund the research and development of new energy technologies. The authors also note that a substantial chunk of this investment will go towards AI. Now, as much as I want to say that this prediction will come true, I don't think that it will. This is primarily because the billionaires that are most likely to spearhead such a project are not the kind that the average person is a fan of, if you catch my drift. The project could also be seen as just a ploy to further increase their wealth, meaning they will likely be less inclined to pursue it. Another reason why I don't think this prediction will come true is because a solution to the energy crisis would paradoxically be bad for the people in power. Having infinite energy with, say, nuclear fusion, which was recently shown to be possible, would make the economy deflationary and crush those with the largest debts. That said, I imagine some version of the Third Stone predicted by Saxo Bank will eventually be introduced. That's because governments around the world are already planning on spending trillions of dollars on energy research and development. That said, I'm not sure I'd want them to be in charge of the energy either. Anyways, Saxo Bank's second prediction for 2023 is that French President Emmanuel Macron resigns and retires from politics. Now, before you yawn or roll your eyes, consider that Germany and France are basically the glue that holds the European Union together, and Macron has been calling for a new EU to be created. Now, the author of this prediction argues that Macron losing the majority in the National Assembly in last year's elections will create serious political issues for France in 2023. This will be due to the continued rise of the French far right, which was ultimately the reason why Macron lost the majority vote in June. The author points out that Charles de Gaulle, the founder of France's modern democratic system, abruptly resigned in 1946 and 1969. The author believes that Macron will do the same sometime early this year and leave French politics. Obviously, Macron will do this to give the impression that he's cast from the same mould as de Gaulle. The author goes as far as predicting that Macron will, quote, realise his long-term dream of establishing a startup and secretly plan his return to French politics the same way de Gaulle did in 1958. Meanwhile, the French far right will continue to grow, further threatening the integrity of the EU. This prediction actually reminds me of something I mentioned in our video from last summer about the collapse of the housing market. The political landscape tends to shift to the right when times are tough and things are expensive. This effect is acute in Europe with the ongoing energy crisis. This is part of why I believe this prediction could come true, but there's a bigger part that the author seems to have overlooked. Macron appears to be surprisingly good friends with Russian President Vladimir Putin. Macron's constant calls for peace in Ukraine have therefore been met with some criticism. Now, depending on what happens in Ukraine, Macron could face extreme pressure from the left wing as well as the right wing to resign. I reckon it's this pressure that would cause Macron to exit politics entirely, not his desire to be seen in the same light as Charles de Gaulle. But then again, well, I don't know the guy. Anywho, Saxo Bank's third prediction is that the price of gold will spike to over $3,000 per ounce after central banks fail to fight inflation. This assumes that Wall Street won't continue to manipulate gold to make inflation look less bad than it is, but that is a topic for another time. The author argues that the catalyst for gold's rally will be the realization that inflation is not transitory, something that's currently being priced in by most investors. At the same time, high interest rates will cause something in the financial system to break, which will force the Fed and friends to pivot. The author also predicts that China's economy will start to reopen early this year and that the pent-up demand of Chinese consumers will cause inflation around the world to accelerate. As it so happens, China has recently started to reopen. Note that Saxo Bank's predictions were published in early December. The author goes on to provide 3 additional demand drivers for gold that will push it to 3K. The first is the demand for neutral assets on central bank balance sheets, the use of gold in technology, particularly new energy sources, and stimulus from governments trying to prevent severe recessions. As a cherry on top, the author highlights the fact that gold's long-term price hit a double top of around 2.1 thousand USD during the pandemic. If gold prices manage to push above that level, then technical analysis suggests 3,000 is the next target. More about technical analysis using the link in the description. Now, as I mentioned a few moments ago, it looks like this author's prediction is slowly starting to come true. Besides being bang on about China's reopening, gold has been rallying in recent weeks and is currently in the process of testing significant price levels that lead to that 2.1K mark. The caveat is that there continues to be a large demand for US dollars. This could continue to suck liquidity from gold and other assets, especially if there's a financial crisis of some kind. The caveat to my caveat is that I'm not an expert gold trader, so I'm happy to be corrected in the comments if I'm wrong. Anyhow, Saxo Bank's fourth prediction is that the EU will create a unified armed force. As a fun fact, the idea of an EU army has been around since the 1950s. As far as I understand, an EU army was never created because Europe instead chose to rely on the US and NATO for support against Eastern Bloc forces. Naturally, the authors argue that the EU will essentially be forced to create its own army because of rising populism in the United States. For reference, many in the Republican Party have been against sending so much war money to Europe and Ukraine. This skepticism will increase as right-wing populism gathers strength. What's interesting is the authors believe the US will only start to reduce its European military support once the war in Ukraine has been resolved. This means that the authors are also simultaneously predicting that the war in Ukraine will end sometime this year, though they don't say this outright. In any case, the authors explain that the absence of US military support in Europe will push the EU to start building its own army, with a completion date of 2028. They speculate that 10 trillion euros will be spent on the creation of the EU army and that this will all be funded through the issuance of debt. Now, oddly enough, the authors think that this will benefit the European bond market. I say oddly because the market for European government debt is very unstable. This instability is the result of dozens of countries with different economies and fiscal policies using the same currency and monetary policy. What's even more odd is that the authors think that the formation of an EU army will benefit the euro, specifically, quote, drive a strong recovery against the US dollar. There's probably a path to such an outcome, but creating a massive army doesn't lead to a strong currency. The economy does. Criticism aside, this prediction is at odds with the prediction that Macron will resign and the reality that many EU countries are politically shifting to the right. National interests will be put above EU interests, lessening the likelihood of an EU army. Never mind the 24 language barriers such an army would have. Now, the fifth prediction for 2023 is particularly spicy, and that's that at least one country will announce a plan to ban all meat production by 2030. By the way, if you're wondering why you keep seeing this 2030 date everywhere, it's because of the United Nations' Sustainable Development Goals. More about the SDGs and what the UN is planning using the link in the description. Moving on. Now, the author argues that meat production is causing too much environmental damage, both directly and indirectly. They claim that food production causes, quote, 1/3 of all planet heating emissions, and that the emissions associated with meat production are twice as high as non-meat food production. The author also claims that countries will not abandon their climate commitments despite the energy crisis. They reveal that net zero requires that everyone cut their meat consumption by almost 2/3. They also reveal that Sweden, the UK, France, and Denmark have legally committed to net zero. Now, surprisingly, the author of this prediction does not believe that any of these countries will be the first to ban meat. Instead, a rogue country will entice ESG investors by announcing that it will begin heavily taxing meat in 2025 and will ban all domestic meat production by 2030. Note that SDGs and ESG are basically the same. The author states that this country will switch to producing and consuming, quote, plant-derived artificial meats and even more humane, less emissions-intensive lab-grown meat. The aforementioned other countries will follow suit in their collective goals to reach net zero by 2050. Oh boy. Now, I'll start by saying that we've already seen what happens when a country commits to ESG. Sri Lanka had one of the highest ESG scores before it collapsed, but I suppose ESG enthusiasts would say that what Sri Lanka did wasn't real ESG. Note that even citizens of oppressive communist regimes could eat meat, when there was any, of course. Now, I don't happen to think that this prediction will come true. I also find it unfortunate that the author is unaware that climate change could quickly be solved through meat production. Now, I don't have the time to get into the details here, but I'll leave a link to that TED Talk in the description. Do give it a watch. Now, the sixth prediction Saxo Bank makes for 2023 is one that hits close to home, and that's that the United Kingdom will hold a referendum to rejoin the EU, assuming it still exists, of course. For those who don't know, the UK held a referendum to leave the EU in 2016. The vote passed by a pretty thin margin. The author argues that the policies of current EU Prime Minister Rishi Sunak will plunge the country into a deep recession. The resulting unpopularity will result in yet another resignation for the Conservative Party. Yet another election will then be held, and all opposition parties will campaign on rejoining the EU. In the end, Labour will win and Brits will vote to rejoin the EU in November 2023. Funnily enough, the author forecasts this outcome because young people in the UK were largely against Brexit. Conversely, old people in the UK were more in favour of Brexit, and much of that voting bloc may have been, well, somewhat thinned out by the pandemic. Now, I myself left the UK towards the end of last year, but what I've seen and heard in dear old Blighty recently suggests that pretty much everyone there is unhappy with the way things are going. It's easy to forget that Britain is an island nation which long ago outsourced most of its industry and was heavily reliant on EU workers for its economic output. Whatever your views are on Brexit, there's no denying that it happened at the worst possible time. It restricted the supply of labour and messed up trade for a few months before the pandemic hit. The pandemic restrictions made these labour and trade issues worse, and the UK hasn't really recovered. Rather than put together a game plan that would bring Britain back from the brink, our Prime Ministers have since been competing to see who is more incompetent and out of touch, while simultaneously beefing up their bios on the World Economic Forum's website. Something tells me that the next one will be yet another young global leader. Regardless, it's clear that the UK needs a change, and while rejoining an institution that seems to be struggling isn't perhaps ideal, it's much better than the alternative. With some luck, the EU will have undergone some sort of reformation as well, which could make rejoining a more attractive prospect for many of my downtrodden fellow Brits. The seventh prediction is that countries will introduce price caps to try and prevent inflation from turning into hyperinflation. Now, this is a scary one because price caps have historically led to shortages, since artificial prices don't bring demand back in line with supply. The author of this prediction argues that wars have historically resulted in price caps and rationing. They reiterate what I just said, namely that governments are failing to address the supply side and are instead, quote, subsidizing excess demand by capping heating and electricity prices for consumers. The author then drops the most valuable insight of the year. Quote, in a war economy, the government hand will expand mercilessly as long as price pressures threaten stability. In other words, governments will do everything they must to maintain control of their respective countries. Remember that one. Now, if that wasn't crazy enough, the author speculates that countries could even start to set caps on wage growth. This is because of something called the wage inflation price spiral, wherein higher wages result in higher prices, and higher prices result in higher wages. As it so happens, once upon a time, 1965, the UK government proposed the creation of a, quote, National Board for Prices and Incomes, which would control wage growth in the name of inflation. The author thinks we could see the creation of such boards in many countries. Now, when it comes to the impact of such policies, the author says that we're doomed to repeat history, with shortages and inflation being imminent. In terms of what effects this will have on assets, they refer the reader to the third Saxo Bank prediction about gold prices. Well played. Now, when it comes to what I think about this prediction, well, it's spot on, I reckon. As I've been implying throughout this video, governmental institutions like the EU are being destabilized by rising costs. They will do everything and anything to keep their structures from falling, even if it makes things worse. Seriously, folks, remember this. Now, Saxo Bank's eighth prediction for 2023 is that OPEC and Chindia will leave the IMF and create their own reserve currency. To clarify, OPEC includes Algeria, Angola, Equatorial Guinea, Gabon, Iran, Iraq, Kuwait, Libya, Nigeria, the Democratic Republic of Congo, Saudi Arabia, the United Arab Emirates, and Venezuela. Chindia is, of course, China and India. As for the International Monetary Fund, or IMF, it's an international organization closely aligned with the United States that provides loans to developing countries with lots of strings attached. For the purpose of this prediction, all you need to know is that the IMF has a currency called the SDR. The Special Drawing Rights, or SDR, is a currency that consists of a combination of US dollars, euros, Chinese yuan, Japanese yen, and British pounds. Last year, it was reported that BRICS countries, Brazil, Russia, India, China, and South Africa, are working on their own version of the IMF's SDR. So, with that context in mind, the author argues that the ongoing weaponization of the US dollar will cause non-US allied countries to create alternative global financial institutions and an SDR alternative. They single out the seizure of assets from Russia's central bank after Russia invaded Ukraine as the catalyst. The author goes on to argue that the Chinese yuan will not become the world's reserve currency because of the country's obsession with capital controls. As such, the more logical move will be for China and its allies to develop an alternative reserve currency that competes with the US dollar. Now, if you've been keeping up with the channel, you'll know that it's quite possible that China and its allies will opt to use Bitcoin instead. This is because there will likely be disagreements about the management of a new reserve currency, including its composition, its issuance, and redemption. By contrast, Bitcoin wouldn't require any trust because its blockchain is trustless. As I like to say, BTC is a credibly neutral currency, and this is exactly what countries concerned about the US dollar need. However, I reckon China and its allies will only consider BTC after their currency experiment fails. Now, the ninth prediction for 2023 is that the yen will fall so quickly this year that it will force the Bank of Japan to intervene and announce a floor of 200 yen per dollar. If you're a fan of Forex, you'll know that the Japanese yen fell to 150 JPY per USD late last year. The author of this prediction argues that the recent recovery in the yen that we've seen will be short-lived. This is because the Fed and other central banks will continue to raise interest rates, while the Bank of Japan continues to try and keep its rate low. If you're wondering why the Bank of Japan, or BOJ, has been keeping interest rates low, it's because Japan has a lot of debt. To put things into perspective, Japan's debt to GDP ratio is well over 200%. This means that a rise in interest rates could cause the Japanese government to default on its debt. The BOJ has been buying up all the government's debt it can to prevent such a default. The BOJ has also been selling US government debt to protect the yen. You should know some analysts believe this selling of US government debt by the BOJ could cause issues in US government debt markets if it continues. The thing is that the BOJ will eventually run out of US government debt to sell, and the author believes the BOJ will begin to pivot once the central bank has depleted half of its US reserves defending the yen. Indeed, recent moves by the BOJ that allowed the 10-year bond yield to move more freely are evidence of that. The author predicts that as the yen continues to slide beyond 170, the BOJ will announce that it will place a floor of 200 yen per dollar. This move will monetize all debt holdings, essentially erasing them and reducing the debt burden. The author predicts that the move will put public debt on course to fall to 100% of GDP. They'll also hike the policy rate to 1% and lift all yield curve controls, thereby allowing the 10-year rate to jump to 2%. This will see inflation soar, but it will also lead to a boom in exports. The author therefore predicts that Japan's real GDP will fall by 8%, whereas the nominal GDP will rise 5% due to the cost of living increases. Now, there's a lot to unpack here, but in sum, these predictions will probably come true. As macro analyst Brent Johnson highlighted in a recent interview, the BOJ will be given the choice between defending the currency and defending the government's debt. History suggests the currency will be sacrificed. Now, Saxo Bank's 10th and final outrageous prediction for 2023 is that there will be a ban on tax havens. This ban will be implemented by the Organisation for Economic Cooperation and Development, or OECD. The OECD coincidentally published global crypto tax standards a few weeks back. More about those in the description. I digress. The author of this prediction argues that the ambitious plans of governments to reshore production, transition to a green economy, and beef up their militaries will require unprecedented spending. Recall the €10 trillion EU army. To reduce debt-related financing, governments will try and collect as much tax as possible. This will result in a ban on tax havens, and the author lists the Cayman Islands, Bermuda, the Bahamas, Mauritius, and the Isle of Man as examples. Now, if I understand correctly, the focus of the tax haven ban will be corporate acquisitions, which will not be possible with tax haven money in OECD countries. To make sure every last drop is squeezed from its citizens, the United States will also abolish capital gains tax and tax any gains from stocks or cryptocurrencies as part of a person's income. The author admits that this will do serious damage to the private equity and venture capital ecosystems. To add insult to injury, the crackdown on tax havens will only increase tax revenue by $500 to $600 billion per year. Now, this is nothing compared to the tens of trillions that governments around the world will spend in their uphill battles against reality. And the worst part is, this money won't be spent effectively. Although I agree that a ban on tax havens is coming, I have a hard time believing that every country will abide by the ban, especially if China and co. start building their own financial infrastructure. Capital will flow to where it's treated best, so there will be a massive incentive for tax havens to continue operating. Now, to be clear, I am not against taxation per se. However, I am against the gross misallocation of capital, which is exactly what happens when a government spends trillions of dollars. But, as with Saxo Bank's other predictions, it looks like everyone is going to learn these lessons the hard way in 2023 and beyond.